Okay, so for this particular lecture, it seems like we're shifting focus a bit, but we're not. So let me explain. We're talking about the Southeastern tribes of the United States, and you might know them or have heard of them as the five quote unquote civilized tribes. When we talk about that terminology, it is really outdated and uh, really very incorrect. And we'll get into why that is a little later. But really, I just want to focus on and emphasize why they're significant to Oklahoma history. And for a lot of you, this is going to be sort of a refresher. But when we talk about the significance of these five tribes in Oklahoma history, they are the first to really develop the land, particularly for economic profit. They're the first to establish schools and churches here, and they're the first to establish constitutional governments. So, when we talk about these five tribes, we're going to go back and create a lot of historical context in terms of the narrative and in terms of the timeline, and create a lot of historical context here. So I want you to keep that in mind. So this is long before they show up in Indian Territory, long before they show up in Oklahoma. But I want you to understand who they were before they got here, in order to understand the the significance of their histories and their contributions. So I want to explain who they were first of all. So let's list them out. These are, of course, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, Creeks, Seminoles, and Cherokees. And if you want to understand where they're located, we are talking about the southeastern region of the United States. So the Seminoles you could find in present day Florida. And then the rest are sort of scattered throughout everywhere from Georgia all the way up through Mississippi, Alabama, and into parts of a little bit into parts of the Carolinas, depending on where you find some of the Cherokees. One of the things that you need to understand about the Cherokees is that there are multiple bands of the Cherokees. We'll get into that a little later on. So I need you to understand that when we talk about especially the Cherokee tribe is huge, and there are different bands of the Cherokee tribe. So there are the Cherokees in the Carolinas. There's the major or the primary Cherokee band living in Georgia. Uh, and then there is a Western Cherokee band living in Arkansas. The Creeks will go through some things that will separate them. So there's a lot going on, and there is a huge number to each of these tribes. The other thing that I want to get into is what united them. And what I mean by uniting them is the similarities among all of these tribes. So when we talk about all of these tribes, there are similarities among all of them, particularly among their customs and their belief systems. So they don't all believe in the exact same thing, but there are similarities that you can see among them. And a lot of that is due to the fact that they are from the same region. And so, because they were from the same region, a lot of that is due to the fact that that there is a history among them that shows that they broke off in the same way, or from the same sort of culture and civilization experience. And so, I want to get into some of these similarities. So, if we get into their religion, for example, they all believe that their universe had been organized into three worlds, right? So they've got the upper world, the underworld, and the world that they currently live in, right? Which had benefited from, the upper world and the underworld, but it also had been haunted by the upper world and the underworld. They all have this belief in the Green Corn Festival, or they all celebrated, not belief, they celebrated the Green Corn Festival. And the Green Corn Festival was essentially a festival of Thanksgiving, but it's also a time for purity, where men would fast and they would drink a liquid to purify themselves. Women, in the meantime, would take flame from this new sacred fire, and they would use that flame to warm their homes, and that flame would also purify their homes. It sounds really similar to what we talked about in the previous lecture about the corn dance. Right. There's also a lot of societal similarities that they share. The relationships they had were matrilineal, which dictated their clan membership. Women owned the homes, the women controlled the land, but men would discipline their children. There's a division of labor among the men and the women. In terms of politics, the chiefdom, so it's run by chiefs, but the chiefdom could extend over several miles. You would have one village sort of serving as the center. So think of it as almost like a capital city. So one village could serve as the center of one particular tribe, and you would have several chiefdoms coming together to form one large political unit. And of course, just like we talked about with the last lecture, it would be a council of men who would lead this chiefdom. And the council of men um, would have to come to a consensus. They would all have to agree on the decisions they made. You could not go forward in division. So everybody would have to agree before they could go forward with anything, whether it was war, whether it was trade, it didn't matter. Everything had to come to a consensus. In terms of currency, there was no money system. Everything was conducted by a barter system instead. So in other words, if you had something worth trading, you would wait until you felt like the trade was fair. Leaders were chosen based on their willingness to share their possessions. So, in other words, if you were willing to share things that were considered incredibly valuable, then it meant that the people trusted you. They trusted you to lead them in times of difficulty and in times of benefit and good times. So, that leads me to let me go back. That leads me to the last point of war, and that's the thing. War was usually in war was something that would take place or driven by feuds between rival clans. It's motivated by revenge. But when we talk about war parties, it was again something that the council had to agree on. It had to be by consensus. It's got to be something that everybody agrees is necessary. The warriors who went had to volunteer to go, right? And that's the key. Consensus is incredibly important here. When we talk about how things change and shift, once again, that's where Europe comes in. And the first ones who come in to shift things, to change things, to influence things, of course, is Spain. Spain is going to show up in Florida, established the first city in the present day United States, of course, which is St. Augustine. Hernando de Soto lands here in 1539, and he will travel from St. Augustine, go west and travel across the Southeast, St. Augustine will serve as the center of Spanish activity. And throughout his travels, he establishes these Catholic outposts, and he sort of, um, encounters all of these different tribes, and these encounters are going to vary depending on who he meets, right? So the Seminole are going to be unique in how they encounter or how they deal with Europeans, and this is important for you to remember, particularly as we go forward in the lecture, because this is especially important um, dealing as we deal with the United States. And that is, when we get into the Seminole in particular, the Seminole are going to be the ones who are willing to fight the most. And by fight, I mean literally fight and go to war. The Seminole are going to be the ones who are the most stubborn and the most unwilling to change and adapt. Whereas the others, it really sort of depends. With these Catholic outposts, of course, the Catholic outposts are designed and purposed for religious conversion, and the Seminole want nothing to do with it. The Seminole have no interest in participating in any sort of religious experience. And that's going to happen a lot throughout the Southeast, but the Seminole in particular are going to be the most difficult to convert. Um, when it comes to Spain, when it comes to Great Britain, Great Britain's first real encounter with the Southeastern tribes will be in Charleston, South Carolina. When we talk about Charleston, South Carolina, and the British settlement there, they immediately began to trade with the Creeks, and later on, they'll trade with the Chickasaws. Now, the Creeks and the Chickasaws are going to be really significant here, because what they trade is going to be initially, it will be furs. But here is what is incredibly important. When we talk about how profitable the fur trade is, um, it will eventually evolve into slave trade. And this is where I need you to take a moment to pause and think about what happens. So, when we talk about the profitability of furs and slave trade and that sort of thing, what I want you to consider here is this. So, when we get into, I'm just going to shorten this because by the time I get it all written, it's going to take forever. So furs means that it's going to lead to a lot of hunting, right? So you're going to have all of these tribes who want to hunt for the benefit of what they get in exchange. And you have to ask yourself, what are the Creeks and the Chickasaws getting in exchange for these furs? And of course, what they are getting will be guns and horses. And remember, those things will lead to ultimately status and power, right? Um, and so as a result, when we talk about um, guns in particular, guns are especially important here, because guns are going to lead to overhunting. Guns are going to lead to the fact that you have way more, animals who are killed, not for the sake of their meat and not for the sake of their skins for clothing and shelter, but for the sake of profit, right? That's the problem here. It's you're hunting them for the sake of I need to make money. And this is really problematic. So instead, what ends up happening is when you run out of fur, when you start to lose the fur, you start to look for something more profitable, in the sense that, okay, I can't give you fur anymore. What can I give you that you absolutely need? And the British are like, well, we're trying to work out in something that would be really helpful. And in South Carolina, in particular, we're trying to raise sugar. And sugar is really hard to raise, it's hard labor. You have to be outside in the heat. And if any of you have been in South Carolina, it is humid and hot. And getting sugar and raising sugar and actually harvesting sugar is incredibly hard labor. And so they don't want to do it themselves. They need labor. And so the Creeks and the Chickasaws were like, you know what? We've got you. What they did was they took captives from other rival tribes and used those captives and brought them in as slaves. That's the key. They brought in slaves. So here's what you've got to remember: from 1600 uh, to, let's see, from 1600 to, and I'm gonna see how well I do this here. No, this is really interesting. So from 1600, this is where you wish for a chalkboard. So from 1600 to 1715, this is supposed to be a, there we go. Let's try that. So from 1600 to 1715, when we talk about the amount of slaves brought in, there are a tremendous amount of Indian slaves brought in. But I want to get into specifics in a minute. I just want you to write down that time period, 1600 to 1715. So Indian slaves are brought in. Now, initially, the problem with Indian slaves in that time, early on, this is early on in the beginning, the slaves, these Indian slaves, would run away and go back to their villages because they knew the area, they knew the region, and they could just go. They were able to run away, escape, and go back. What ends up happening is these British plantation owners figured out that, okay, we can't keep these people here, so rather than try to keep these people in this area and make them work for us, as slaves on these plantations, what we're going to do is we are going to create a system that is actually going to be profitable to us. In other words, we are going to create a trade. So, what I mean is, we are going to take the slaves that the Creeks and the Chickasaws bring, and we are going to trade them to different parts of the colonies, the other British colonies, so that other people can be brought in and work for us. That's the slave trade, the Indian slave trade. So I'm going to bring us back to this time period right here, 1600 to 1715. From 1600 to 1715, more native peoples are exported out of South Carolina into places like the West Indies. So we are talking about the West Indian Islands, such as Jamaica, such as all of these islands that the British had occupied, to do work such as working as sugar plantations there, rice plantations out there. So they are sent, when I say they are sent abroad, I mean they are sent away, thousands of miles away, hundreds of miles away. And And during that time period, over the course of 115 years, more native slaves are exported out of South Carolina than African slaves are imported into South Carolina. I'm going to say that again, just so you understand the numbers that we are dealing with here. More Native Americans are exported out of South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, than Africans are imported into South Carolina. So we are talking about hundreds of thousands of people over the course of 115 years. This is a tremendous amount uh, of of work here, and when we talk about how important this development is, it shows you um, the the level of influence that the Europeans have here, right? Particularly when it comes to guns and horses. And it's going to evolve too, because the impact that alcohol will have is also going to change the nature of this relationship tremendously. So, uh, when we talk about the French relationship here, the French are going to add a new dynamic as well, because the French, as I mentioned last week, they have settlements all throughout the Mississippi River, but their influence in this particular area, they will bring in settlements along the Gulf of Mexico. And for the Southeastern tribes, the French are going to be really problematic. The reason why they are problematic is because they are a competitor with the Southeastern tribes. They are the main competitor for the fur trade. Um, and so there is a lot of violence that takes place when it comes to competition for hunting grounds. And that's going to really be problematic when it comes down to violence in this region. And nothing demonstrates this better than, of course, the French Chickasaw War from 1736 to 1739. So this takes place in the Mississippi River Valley. So this is a really crucial area in terms of this whole idea of empire, especially for the French, right? So the French have been, really fighting to extend their level of control in this region. The English are right there. So when we talk about, let me see if I can go back to my pen here. So keep in mind, you have the English here, uh, you know, sort of controlling this area, and you'll have the French um, controlling, sort of fighting for control in this area. When we talk about this region and how contested it is, what's important that you've got to, understand is that this region is so violent, it's so important that when we talk about um, this fight for control, it's between both the English and the French, but it's really going to heavily involve the Southeastern Indians, right? So the Chickasaws are armed, they are committed warriors. And the Chickasaws are allied with the English. And the English are really counting on the Chickasaws. So when I say the French and Chickasaw War, I mean the French and the Chickasaws are fighting against each other, right? and the Chickasaws are counting on, or the English are counting on the Chickasaws to maintain their control of the area, maintain their control of that region, particularly these hunting grounds, because the English need, or want the benefits of those furs, and the Chickasaws want the benefit of English weapons and English horses, right? And the French, of course, want control of the region themselves, and so the French are counting on their allies, who are the Choctaws. And so when we talk about the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws, when they war against each other, it's really problematic because the Chickasaws are so determined, and they are also incredibly heavily armed. And so the Choctaws are easily defeated. And that makes it really problematic for the French, right? When we talk about this lineup here, this battle between the French and the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws and the English, the French are in a lot of trouble because they are needing desperately to hold on to whatever control they have. And so this man, who was pictured here, Jean-Baptiste Le Monsieur de Bienville, he serves as the governor of the entire territory of Louisiana. Remember, the entire territory being that entire central region of present day United States, right? That entire territory is known as Louisiana. 1735, so just before the war breaks out, he actually wrote to Paris saying that we are seeking out support for the entire destruction of the Chickasaws. He says it's become so bad and so competitive that nothing less than their entire destruction is acceptable. And so he is basically organizing this plan to send, two large military expeditions into um, the Chickasaw territory. So he is, in his organization, in his plan, they are stockpiling supplies. He and his men have sent in spies into Chickasaw territory. They've also started to, build a new fort in the Choctaw Nation, uh, to help provide protection for the army. So by the time 1736 rolls around, and we're talking about April of 1736, they leave his army, Bienville's army, de Bienville. His army leaves present day Mobile, Alabama. So here's Mobile, Alabama. Let me get my pen out for you so you can see it a little better. Um, Here is present day. Here is Mobile, Alabama. This is where they begin. Mobile, Alabama, with 600 men. So the 600 men include French regulars, but it also includes Swiss regulars, so men from Switzerland. There's also local militia, they have volunteers, but they also have 45 black slaves. And so by the time they get into where they need to get into, which is Choctaw Nation, it's a couple of weeks later. It's about 16 days later. By the time they get to Choctaw Nation, they add, so that's right here. So they get to the fort. So it's about 2 weeks. They get to the fort. They add another 600 warriors. Okay. So in getting to the 600 warriors, now they've got 1,200 men ready for battle. So, um, they've got the 1,200 men ready for battle. And in the meantime, they've got another group. So, I don't know if you could see this. So, let me just highlight it. They've got another group of men coming from this area. That's so this area right here that I've weirdly circled, it looks like a liver. Um, that's a group of 400 men coming from present day Illinois. And those group of men are led by a Major Artaguet. And you don't need to worry about his name, but Artaguet is a French major who was bringing with him the 400 men, but also bringing supplies as well. So Artaguet is following the Mississippi River, and he is going from the Mississippi River, going into Memphis, present day Memphis, and this is happening somewhere around. He starts his journey in early February, so he starts 2 months before Debienville starts his. He essentially tried to connect with Debienville for 21 days. The problem, though, is that he didn't realize that Debienville had not left Mobile. So let's just say there was a little snafu with communication. Debienville did not um, realize that Artaguet had left that early, and Artaguet did not realize that Debienville had not left until April. So Artaguet launched an attack on a Chickasaw town on his own. So with 400 men, Artaguet decided he was going to just launch an attack. Uh, and ends up easily defeated. I mean, of course he did. He's only got 400 men. Of the 400 men, 20 survived. 20, as in 20. Uh, Meanwhile, here comes Debienville. Debienville ends up here in the town of Akia, which is present day Tupelo, Mississippi. This is late May. He orders an attack with his 1,200 men. 3 hours later, so this is May 26th. May 26th, he orders an attack. 3 hours later, Debienville basically says, I can't take it anymore. This is enough. He orders a retreat, and that's the end of that. That's with his 1,200 men. So it's done. That's over. 3 years later, he tries it again. Debienville tries it again. That's in 1739. This time he comes in with an even larger army, 1,200 regular and militia troops, and 1,500 northern and southern Indian auxiliaries. So this time they're coming in with 2,700 men. It's the largest military force assembled to meet an Indian adversary in the West. It's the largest assembled to that point, let me just add. 2,700. It still didn't matter. It still didn't matter primarily because of this area right here. So, this area right here is known as the Chickasaw Bluffs. They got so bogged down in that area. It was the same region that these two groups got bogged down in the last time. So they asked the Chickasaws to accept a ceasefire, and all they requested was, please, let's just exchange prisoners, and please let us walk away with our men, and let us go home. And then Debienville, who retreated, by the way, retreated back to Mobile, still declared it a victory. How? Why? We don't know. Now, in terms of how ultimately this works out, essentially alliances determined who you were going to trade with. So the French would trade with the Choctaws, the English would trade with the Chickasaws, and alliances would end up determining where you would get your military assistance, right? That's the thing. It also helps to determine who you don't mess with, right? And it's clear that the Chickasaws were not to be messed with. They dominated this area, and the English chose well. The English chose very well. Okay, so uh, let's go forward here in the lecture and talk about how this develops even more with the French. And that leads me to the French and Indian War. Now, you guys should be very familiar with the French and Indian War, primarily because the French and Indian War is incredibly important in shaping the United States. It's foundational in colonial history, colonial American history. It is foundational in shaping reasons for the Revolutionary War. It is also incredibly important in shaping why we get into a revolutionary mindset in the first place. So you should be very familiar and comfortable with the French and Indian War. Okay. If you are not, you need to go back into your US history textbook and refamiliarize yourself with it. I am going to teach it in this context with a slightly different sort of context here to tie it into Oklahoma history. So when we talk about the French and Indian War, remember the French and Indian War is known as the 7 Years' War, right? It's the war that begins in Europe between the French and the British. But when we talk about the French and Indian War in North America, remember, this is essentially about what this comes down to is empire, right? This is ultimately a war about empire between the French and the British, who never liked each other in the first place. Still, it's pretty questionable. But when we talk about this conflict between the French and the British and this whole question of empire, it really comes down to this conflict in North America about the size of British colonies versus where the French occupy and how the French occupied their territory in North America, right? So let's talk about what it looks like in North America. Um, so the French had expanded into the Ohio River Valley, right? And because they had expanded into the Ohio River Valley, there are repeated conflicts with the claims of British colonists. The colonies had grown significantly in terms of population sizes, right? So initially, and you're looking at a map here of North America in 1700, you can see that the English are right along the East Coast. You have the Spanish still sticking around with the occupation of Spanish Florida. You have the Spanish still occupying Mexico and parts of present day American Southwest. And then you have the unexplored West, which is technically, you know, kind of true, but not really, because the Spanish had gone into that part of the West anyway. But I want to focus primarily on what the French are occupying, because the English in 1700 had essentially in 1700 had a population of about 250,000 people living in their colonies. In 50 years, however, that population size is going to explode. So in 1700, it's 250,000 people living there. By 1750, it will grow to 1.25 million people. 1.25 million people. And all those people are going to need somewhere to live. Now, keep in mind, before, even in 1700, there are constant clashes between colonists and native peoples who are living there. Imagine 1.25 million people living there, and you've got the French who are occupying this much space, and they are occupying this space. Keep this in mind as well. They are not occupying this space and establishing colonies. They are just occupying this space in terms of establishing settlements in the name of trade posts and military posts. They're there to hunt. They're there to find fur, make money off of the fur, and go. They're not occupying it in the sense of establishing colonies. So it's not like their citizens are showing up and creating new lives for themselves. They're just there willy nilly hunting. And so British colonists have a huge problem with this because here's all of this space, all of this land that's essentially, at least in their eyes, unoccupied. And here we are living in the on the East Coast, crammed, with no land available, and we need the space to live. So the colonists, British colonists, appealed to the king for permission to raise armies and money to defend themselves from French encroachment, because what they felt like was happening was that the French were trying to push the British out even more to try and occupy the East Coast. And even then, the British are trying to stretch out into French area, and the French were having a huge problem with that. And in the meantime, of course, the European continent is, has broken out into a fight that had started in 1754 in the first place, because the British and the French are already fighting with each other over the issue of empire. So it doesn't help that the British and the French are already at each other's throats. And now the colonists are fighting with the French in North America, right? So let's talk about who's involved over here. In North America, when we're talking about um, what's happening in terms of native peoples, and the fight for, control, European control in North America, there are several tribes that you need to be aware of. So let's talk about who is involved, because on both sides of this fight, these native tribes do get involved. And remember, as I told you in the previous slide, there are alliances that matter, and alliances do contribute quite a bit here, right? So when we talk about the French side of the war, the French will have the Ottawa, the Mississaugas, the Wyandots, and the Potawatomis. And they are fighting for their own particular reason. They are motivated to add captives. They are fighting for adding captives, or fighting for captives in terms of um, their own population sort of addition. With the British, they have the tribes of the Ohio River Valley, mostly the Shawnees, and the Delaware, members of the Shawnee tribe and the Delaware tribe. They had initially, just so you know, they had initially joined um, the French, uh, not in this particular fight. Um, but essentially, they joined the French effort unenthusiastically, is the way I described it. And in fact, others have described it this way as well. But when we talk about uh, their alliances, they weren't always sided with the British. They had unenthusiastically joined the French effort, um, because the British had been defeated before, and so they had joined the French before um, because the British hadn't always won their fights, and that's the other thing. So that's something that I want you to remember when we ask the question of why they get involved in the first place, why they even fight. This is not a question of loyalty. That's something that you have to remember. This is not about loyalty. It's just about defeating the other side, whoever it is, that needs to be fought. Right? It's just about defeating one side or the other. And if one side can leave, that would be great. That's really what's important. That's really what matters here. Um, and in this particular war, that's going to be important. When we talk about the significance of the French and Indian War, as you guys hopefully know, and hopefully remember, the British end up gaining control of the entire North American frontier as a result of this war, right? They signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Um, and as a result of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, France is forced to surrender anything and everything they have to the British and the Spanish, right? Um, but here's the problem: uh, there are land claims um, that are surrendered without any consultation, any conversation with the Native Americans who were involved in the fight. And that's what you have to learn and remember from this. Native Americans are not brought in to this negotiation. It is not even a matter of allowing them to include their opinion. What is it that you agreed to in this? So the Ottawas, the Mississaugas, the Wyandots, the Potawatomis, anything and everything they have doesn't matter. All of it is lost. The Delaware, the Shawnees, because they were in on it, none of that matters either. Whatever they contributed. Thanks for your help. It doesn't matter that they were a part of it. Um, and that's where Pontiac's rebellion becomes important. So Pontiac is a significant figure here, primarily because this becomes a huge battle over uh, not just a region or land claims. It becomes a significant statement on who uh, gets to be at the table, right? Who gets to be present at the negotiating table? Who gets to be present in the conversation? Who gets to be present in the room? Pontiac is actually a chief who is leading the fight over the issue of land claims in the northern Great Plains region, specifically around the Great Lakes. And these would be, as you can see on the right hand side in this in this map, there are several battles fought, and in the diagram there, you can see all of the British forts that are taken by Pontiac's men, and all of the battle sites that are there. But essentially, what ends up happening is these people are already exhausted by many years of war. Pontiac and his men, his people, are exhausted by many years of war. It's not just one war. It's not just the French and Indian War. It's fighting with the French over control over the fur trade. It's also fighting with other tribes over control over the fur trade and hunting grounds. It's fighting with the British. It's fighting with the Spanish. It's this constant fight over regional control, over empire. It's been constant. And eventually, what ends up happening is there is this royal proclamation declared, because the British don't want to fight anymore. It's this royal proclamation that is declared that essentially draws this invisible line that goes north and south along the Appalachian Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountains essentially is this dividing line, that says that the British will not cross west of the Appalachian Mountains, and Native peoples can settle and live happily and peacefully west of the Appalachian Mountains, without fear of harassment from British colonists, which, as we know, is not going to last very long. But really, the significance of Pontiac's rebellion, and as this map refers to it as Pontiac's War, is that it badly erodes the relationship between the English and Native peoples, um, for a lot of reasons. They're not allowed to speak for themselves, to occupy their space, to be at the negotiating table, to have their own, um, to even be included whatsoever in terms of their own sort of um, civilization and government, right? It's not even respected that they would be, um, that they would have any kind of say in the outcome of the war, right? And that is a trend that you need to be mindful of in the years, decades, centuries to come. So, when we talk about the British and how they will continue to evolve and spread and go forward, I want you to take a look at this map and watch how quickly things change. So, in the dark red, as you can see here, in the dark red, you can check out how they're how quickly and how easily things spread. So before 1763, this is essentially the space that they occupy, right along the East Coast. And the Royal Proclamation pretty much, draws this line that says, we occupy all of this space, but don't worry, along the Appalachian Mountains, right along this line, we are going to stay up here. But that doesn't necessarily stay the same, right? The Spanish occupy this area along the Rio Grande and just north of it. But remember, this becomes Spanish Louisiana all throughout this region. And this area is, of course, undefined, and technically that's all unexplored. But keep in mind, this entire region is occupied by Native peoples. The whole place, all of it, is occupied by Native peoples. And that's when we bring in the Americans. Okay. So keep in mind, French and Indian War has been fought, and the French and Indian War is going to lay down the ideological foundations for the Revolutionary War, right? It's going to lay down the ideological foundations because you're going to have the British believing that the Americans have all of this money, and these colonists can pay more, contribute more to the British Empire, yada yada yada. And so that is going to lead to, of course, the American Revolution, right? So, when we talk about the American Revolution and why it is so significant to Native peoples and why it is so significant to the Southeastern tribes, we have to talk about alliances. The Southeastern tribes, in particular, will ally themselves with the British. Here's why. When we talk about the British relationship with Southeastern tribes, it is a long relationship, right? These Southeastern tribes are not dumb. They know, they observe, they understand, they know that the colonists don't have money. They know that the colonists are out-armed. They know that the colonists are not fully united. They're not stupid. They know that the British have money, they have the weapons, they have the navy. They know that the British have a more united front. They know that the British are an empire. The British have an empire. Um, and listen, let's be honest. On paper, the British win this. I mean, there's no way that the American colonists win this. There's just no way. And really, if we're being honest, they just don't until um, they win a couple of major battles and then the French show up, right? And the French finally show up as an ally, and that's when everything shifts, right? So you have to have um, some major changes in the trend, in the trajectory here, right? So the Southeastern tribes ally themselves with the British because that's what they believe will win. um that's who they believe will win this war. And to be fair, you're going to go with the winner in the end, right? You don't want to ally yourselves with the guys who you think are going to lose. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, there are consequences to that, though. And that's the thing. If you make an alliance with the guys who end up losing, there is a price to pay. And in your notes, put a star by that, put an asterisk by that, and highlight it, do something, put an arrow by that, because that's going to haunt them later on as well. And by them, I mean the Southeastern tribes. That is a decision that will haunt them again in the decades to come. They are going to ally themselves with the losing side, and there will be a price to pay. So, in terms of the consequences that they will have to deal with, they are going to lose quite a bit. Thousands of their own warriors will be killed in this Revolutionary War. Thousands of their own people will become slaves. Thousands of their own people will die due to exposure to disease. Um, they will lose access to white-tailed deer, um, most of which are killed not because of their meat, which is what the Southeastern tribes use them for. White-tailed deer were used for their hide and for their meat. So it was essential for, especially for the winter, for meat and for their hides. Most of these deer were killed off primarily for their hide. They lose access to that, and they're overhunted, so it's a tremendous amount of waste. Finally, because of the war, you have you have all of these brand new mixed blood families. And mixed blood families are going to completely change the dynamic and the power structure of all of these tribes. I'm going to say that again so that you know to emphasize that in your notes. Mixed blood families are going to completely change the dynamic and the power structure of these tribes. And that's something that is a huge and probably the most significant consequence of them all. Okay. So let's get into the Treaty of Paris. This is again a completely different Treaty of Paris. Let me just say, anytime somebody asks you what did the Treaty of Paris say, ask them which one, because there are multiple. There are lots of treaties of Paris. I mean, a lot of wars ended in Paris. Paris is an amazing city. Okay, so in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, um, there is a question that comes up about making peace with the tribes. So when we talk about making peace with the tribes, one of the questions that comes up, and hang on, let me just see. Okay. So one of the questions that comes up in terms of how to make peace with the tribes, commissioners are sent to meet with native representatives in the year of 1786. So this is 3 years after the Treaty of Paris is signed. To meet with native representatives in South Carolina. Um, and let me just say, not everybody is thrilled about this. The Creek tribe, for example, did not show up. The Creek tribe did not send anyone because they were very unhappy with the now state of Georgia because they believed that Georgia was very crappy to them and did not treat them well at all. That said, the negotiations went on without them because the negotiators were not going to wait for the Creeks. So here's what the agreements ended up looking like. When we talk about the agreements and how this would proceed, the tribes had to recognize American dominion. The tribes had to recognize American dominion. In other words, the tribes had to recognize that the United States was in charge. Another part of the agreement, the United States officially defined tribal boundaries. The United States defined tribal boundaries. Each of these tribes gave up tracts of land, quote unquote, small tracts of land, to the United States so that the United States could build military posts and trading posts. So the Creek would have, um, you know, would give up some land, the Cherokee, the whoever, and you would have all of these different posts throughout the Southeast with each with a different purpose. Now, in terms of how these tribes would be treated, each tribe was recognized as sovereign. In other words, each tribe is recognized as their own autonomous, their own government, their own authority. And so as a result, they were in charge of their own internal affairs. So however you ran your tribe, if you've got your own issue going on inside of your own tribe, However you dealt with it before, that's how you're going to continue dealing with it. You are your own tribe. Do you need to change things with the United States? If does the United States need to change things with you? The only way we're going to do that is with a new treaty. We are not going to. So, in other words, if we need more land from you, we are not going to edit the old treaty. We're just going to create a new one. And so, if change is necessary, we are going to negotiate another treaty, and that treaty would be ratified by the Senate. The next thing we're going to do is it's establish a new department. So remember, this government in the United States is brand new, and one of the first things that this government does, even with the Articles of Confederation, is recognize that something has to be established that deals specifically with Indian affairs. And that's where you get to establish the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, there are goals that the United States has ultimately, and the goals early on um, all point to this one idea, and the one idea is assimilation. So I want to talk about what that means, right? All of these people, all of these native peoples practice these ideas that seem um, backwards to these European descended, super traditionalist, very conservative, extremely white peoples. They hunted, they didn't wear the same clothes, they spoke different languages, they had different religious beliefs, their skin was a bit darker, their traditions were different, their cultural values were different. And so you've got to push these ideas of changing their way of life. And the way that you do that is by pushing these ideas of farming, pushing these ideas of religion, and pushing this message of education. And these have to be your style of farming, your style of religion, and your style of education. I want to talk about assimilation for a second, and this whole idea of how it's justified, right? So when we talk about assimilation, remember, assimilation is what it means, of course, is to become like somebody else, or to become like the larger culture, or um the larger culture around you, right? So the expectation was that native peoples were to set aside the natural life in the wilderness for a life that was dependent on agriculture, and a life that was dependent on um, a life that was centered around the domestic arts. So, women would cook and clean and raise their children, and men would become farmers, and they would center their lives on God and Christianity and that sort of thing. And when we talk about the justification for that, it's all sort of driven by ideals that Thomas Jefferson is really going to push. And we'll get into that further later on when we get into the next lecture, which will be Indian removals. But Thomas Jefferson is really going to be the guy who pushes this message of racial evolution. And he's not the father of this thinking, not by any means, but it is something that is born out of the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, there is this thinking that is based on on this idea of racial evolution, and this idea that there are races that are more evolved than others. So, there are Enlightenment thinkers who were scientists who believed that there were such things as uh, a human taxonomy. There's a guy named Johann Blumenbach, for example, who would create the human taxonomy and say that Caucasians were at the top of human evolution. They were the most intelligent, the most evolved, the most beautiful, and those who were African were the least evolved, the least intelligent, the least attractive, and Native Americans were somewhere towards the middle of this evolutionary scale. And Thomas Jefferson would be among those Enlightenment thinkers who bought into this idea of the human taxonomy and believed that Native peoples had the potential to evolve. They had the potential to become better, perhaps not equal to in every sense of the word, but get close, become uh, as intelligent as white people. And he says that essentially it is their responsibility to help Native peoples become that evolved, right? So when we talk about this whole idea of assimilation and why it's important, remember, assimilation is making yourself available to the idea of evolving, right? It's you making the choice of setting aside the old ways and adopting new ways, adopting new ideas and making them your own, right? And so that's what it means to assimilate. And um the hope was that in doing so you could become more evolved, right? That you could become more like the larger population around you. Jefferson says it was for the benefit of Native peoples. It was so that they could fulfill their great potential. Now, that's Jefferson, the Enlightenment thinker. But if you were to ask others, they would tell you it's so that they could make land available for everybody else. That's the real key. Assimilation wasn't, about, the good, the potential. It was just about land availability and profit. When we talk about the racial factor, though, that's really the key, because Native Americans and the probability of assimilation and the possibility of them evolving is an important factor. The fact that they were given the chance to evolve is something that I want you to really take into consideration here, because when you have guys like Thomas Jefferson uh, going to bat and giving them the chance of being able to say that Native Americans really do have the potential here, he does take it a step forward. And he says, listen, the only thing slowing Native Americans down, the only thing stopping them from achieving full equality is their environment. There is nothing genetically stopping them. There is nothing in their DNA that prevents them from being equal to us. It is only the environment. They just haven't been taught differently. They haven't been exposed to better influences. That's where we come in. Africans, in his argument, and not just in his, Voltaire is going to make this same argument. Speaking of Enlightenment thinkers, Blumenbach speaks this same argument as well. Africans and their descendants do not have any potential for equality because they don't have the this kind of potential in their DNA. It's just not in their code, right? And this is the problem. There are a couple of different ways that Native Americans respond. You have the progressives. And those are the people who will welcome it. Um, they welcome the idea of assimilation, not because they wanted to be a part of American society. Let me make that clear. It's not because they want to be Americans, they want to be Europeans. It's not because they want to be white. It's because they are doing what they can to preserve any semblance of autonomy. They are trying to preserve any semblance of tribal independence, right? And what they're trying to do is they're looking at the situation, and they're seeing this as, okay, if we, maintain some sort of visual as quote unquote being civilized, then we're going to get more respect from these white people. If we dress like them, if we change our homes to look like their homes, if we establish tribal governments that look like their national government, if we do what they're asking us to do, maybe, just maybe, they will respect our boundaries, respect our sovereignty, and leave us alone. They are not doing it so they can be like white people. This is what I want you to understand. They are not doing it to be like white people. They are doing it just so they can survive. I need you to become comfortable with this term of progressives in the context of Native American history. So when I say progressives here, and I've got those quotes, I need you to understand it in this context. Words matter. So when I say progressives here, and then somebody else talks to you about the progressive era, it's not the exact same thing. This is different. This is just slightly different. So there are some similarities in that it means open-mindedness. They both mean open-mindedness. They're open-minded to new ideas, but it's slightly different in that their motivations are different. Okay. So native peoples are who are progressive are they are progressive in the sense that they want to, or they are willing to try to assimilate for the sake of, survival. However, there are also traditionalists, and this is another term that I need you to understand and be comfortable with in the context of Native American history. Now, the other thing that I need you to remember is that these two terms are going to come up over and over and over again, especially with the Southeastern tribes. So be ready for that. When we talk about these traditionalists, the traditionalists are going to refuse assimilation. They hate the idea of assimilation. They refuse to compromise. They, these are people who are very strongly adhering to the belief that compromise means changing who they are, changing their customs, changing their identity, and they refuse to do it even for the sake of survival. This to them is there's no area for debate. There's no gray area for them, and that's important to remember as well. Okay, so as we go on, I want to talk about how they assimilate. Right? What the areas where they start to show signs of assimilation. And it starts to show up in their life and in their culture, right? So, when we go, let me go back for a second. So, it's going to show up in their economies, for example. You start to see American currency showing up uh, within the tribes. So, if you want to, for example, purchase things, you no longer are dealing with bartering. You go when you go to the trade posts, it's American currency that's showing up. Um, People within these southeastern tribes are living in log cabins. They change the way that they dress. So their clothing is different. Cotton clothes now have replaced deerskin, so they are wearing actual cotton fabric, cotton material rather than deerskin. Missionaries are now working and living, not just working, but actually living among these tribes. When we talk about how they're living there and how they're working there, you start to see the first appearances and the first establishment of mission schools. These mission schools, the principal goal of mission schools was to teach students how to read and write in English. Um, the problem, though, is that um, for a lot of these tribes, for most of these tribes, they don't have their own written language. They have the language that they speak, um, but with their language that they speak, they don't have a correlating written language. And as a result, that's where you have the appearance of Sequoia. Sequoia, as many of you know, and his picture will come up in a minute, will create the first alphabet for the Cherokee. Um, and that becomes incredibly significant. There we go. I had to go back and add Sequoia's picture there so you can actually see him because he wasn't showing up. So, Sequoia, of course, created an alphabet for the Cherokee, which was significant not just for the sake of having an alphabet for the written language, but it would be support. It was also important. For the sake of the purpose of having missionaries around, which brings me to the point of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. This particular board is important because it was actually a joint venture of several different denominations. It was the Congregational Presbyterian and Dutch Reformed churches. I'll say those again: Congregational, Presbyterian, and Dutch Reformed churches, who came together to establish this board, and organized to send missionaries around the world. So not just into different parts of the United States, around the world, to people who they believed needed to be ministered to, and that included Native peoples. And so they sent missionaries into um, the southeastern tribes, and they began working with the Cherokee tribe in 1816. And when we talk about the Cherokees, the reason why they sent people in with the Cherokees is that of the southeastern tribes, the Cherokees were actually the most receptive. They were the ones who were most willing to listen. They were the ones who were most willing to receive them. They were the ones who were, quote unquote, the most progressive. Again, I'm going to ask you to remember what I mean by progressive in this context, right? They're the ones who are most willing to adapt to the idea of assimilation, not because they want to be white, not because they want to be like the Americans, but because they are trying to survive and preserve what they can, right? So by 1817, a school is built within the Cherokee tribe, the Cherokee Nation, I mean, called the Brainerd School. So Brainerd is spelled Brainerd, the Brainerd School. There's also a model farm that's created. The model farm is literally a model farm used to sort of teach and train the Cherokees on how to be farmers. It is led by the work there is led by these two men, Daniel Burtrick and Samuel Worcester. Both of them are pivotal in the missionary work among the Cherokees, but they are also pivotal in the kind of relationship that the Cherokees have in understanding what it means to assimilate. But let me just add here very quickly that these are not typical missionaries that are demanding assimilation. These two men learn the Cherokee language, they learn the culture of the Cherokees. They are not demanding of the Cherokees. They are not demanding that the Cherokees behave like white people or that sort of thing. These men become like the Cherokees in that sense, right? So there's a lot of assimilation going the other way as well. And so Worcester, especially, is going to be really important and influential here. So, hint, hint, pay a lot of attention to Worcester. Worcester is going to be also very important here because he's going to be the guy who takes Sequoia's alphabet and translates the English Bible into Cherokee, and makes Christianity accessible to the Cherokee people. So he's going to be especially important. Now, when it comes to Christianity and the Southeastern tribes, overall, when you're looking at the Southeastern tribes overall, there is very little interest in Christianity. Very, very little. Um, Initially, when these missionaries are sent into these tribal areas, um, the deal is this: the tribal governments tell all of these missionaries, look, you can teach the tribes, you can educate them at the schools, but keep your faith to yourself. Teach them how to speak English, teach them the sciences, teach them math, so bring your education, but keep your faith to yourself. And here's why. And this is just something to keep in mind. And you guys know this from all of your history classes. There are two things that are incredibly personal to all individuals: their faith or their lack of, and their money. You don't mess with either of those things. A person's faith or their lack of, and their money. You don't mess with those things. Their money and their money or their livelihood and their religious beliefs, right? And that's what the Cherokee had to say to Bertrick and Worcester. You can come here and you can educate our children. That's great. You can train us how to be farmers. We would appreciate that. But don't tell us what to believe. Um, and that's how it's going to be for all of the religions. In fact, by 1819, um, there are the Choctaw will welcome missions into their territory in present day Mississippi. Um, there will be tribes that will welcome these missionaries primarily because they want the mission schools. But the only tribe, even the Seminoles, will. But in 1822, the Creeks, who will prove to be even more stubborn than the Seminoles. 1822, the Creek said, no, I see what y'all are doing. You're trying to convert us in terms of religion. In 1822, they kept all of the missionaries out. For the Choctaws, um, the Choctaws had Presbyterians come in. So the Presbyterians were trying to convert the Choctaws. So the Presbyterians had built their schools, built a model farm, and trying to convert the Choctaws was ridiculous. It took 10 years before a single Choctaw converted to Christianity. Um, when this sort of thing started to translate into Indian territory here in Oklahoma, the Methodist Church is going to have the same sort of struggle. What ends up happening is Native people will be receptive to the idea of education, but not to Christianity. And even if they do become receptive to Christianity, it's only because they make it a Christianity that they like. In other words, they change Christianity, they adapt Christianity, um, to the kinds of ideas that fit their culture and their ideas. So, for example, here in Oklahoma, among the Kiowa and Comanche, this will be a few decades later in the 1860s and 1870s. Um, the Kiowa and Comanche will like certain aspects of Christianity and then leave out other aspects of Christianity. This happens all throughout the United States. There are certain tribes who love the aspect of the Virgin Mary. And so they keep that story, but leave out others, right? Um, there are going to be problems with Christianity, with the tribes, especially with the idea of Indian removal. Um, Indian removal is going to hurt the cause of Christianity, right? Because um, for the Creeks, for example, the Creeks blame Christianity for removal, and believe that Christians were either supportive of removal policies or standing idly by and allowed it to happen. So Christianity can either make you or break you in this cause of assimilation. Tribal government is a really excellent and probably the best way of demonstrating assimilation. And so I do want to make sure that you pay attention to what's going on here. Tribal government really changed under the pressure of the Americans and very wealthy mixed blood native peoples. The wealthy mixed blood native peoples, and I need to emphasize this, wealthy mixed blood native peoples became wealthy thanks to a couple of things. One, their influence and their connections with the Americans, and because of things like trading posts. That's where they're going to bring in their most wealth. The problem, though, is that they want to gain power and access to influence within the tribes. And that's why you see a lot of this pressure to change the makeup of their tribal government. So, this is where I want to bring up um, the examples of how they changed their tribal government. So, in 1808, for the Cherokees, that's where you're going to see their first written laws in tribal history. So in 1808, they established their first written laws. And this is where you're going to see how they establish a police force. And this police force is created to find and try and execute criminals. They get rid of matrilineal descent and establish patrilineal descent. So that's clearly um, the influence of American law. The other thing they do is they establish what's known as the Cherokee National Committee. The Cherokee National Committee is an executive committee of 13 members. And that's essentially what they use as what their equivalent of a federal government. That's their equivalent of a federal government. That's going to change in 1817. So in 1808, they have the executive committee of 13 members. It's going to change in 1817 when they establish a powerful and independent executive body. And then by 1827, so just 10 years after that, they're going to create a brand new constitution. And the constitution that they create is modeled entirely after the United States' constitution. So they take three different steps to establish a tribal government that slowly but surely makes them look more and more and more like the United States. Um, they also established a new capital in northwestern Georgia known as New Eshota. Eshota is spelled Echota, New Eshota. And that's for the Cherokees. The Choctaws in 1826 will create their first constitution. They establish a central government with three central chiefs, and they have a council of elected representatives. Along those lines, and I think I have this here, along those lines, um, let me just add this, and it's not just the Creeks. I'll add this as well. Creeks and the Seminoles. The Creeks and the Seminoles did not have written laws until after their removal. So not until after 1830 will they have their own written laws. Um, the Chickasaws will adopt written laws in 1829. So each of these groups, the Cherokees will start it in 1808, Choctaws in 1826, Chickasaws in 1829. The Creeks and the Seminoles will wait until 1830, until after 1830. Now, I do want to add this, and I don't know if I have it on here or not. So I do want to add this. There is this concept among, or this idea among traditionalists in particular that I want to make sure you understand. Um, Traditionalists are at this point going to be more often than not full-blooded native peoples, and progressives are going to be more often than not mixed bloods. So I'm going to say that again. Traditionalists are going to be quote unquote full-blooded native peoples, and and mixed blood peoples are going to be progressives. Um and so this is really, again, where you're going to start to see a lot of resistance versus assimilation. There's going to be huge division, significant division that will, from time to time, cause a tremendous amount of violence. It will cause tribal division that will last for generations. It will cause violence between the United States and the tribes. It's going to be really heavy. So these are things that I want you to be mindful of as we go forward in the narrative.